Hi there and welcome to this, to Rethinking the Human Factor podcast with me, your host, Bruce Hallis. It's great to have you here with us on the show today. Now, for those of you who are new to the show, what is the show all about? Well, the show is all about raising awareness, influencing behaviour, and fostering an organisational culture where information security and data protection are truly valued. Now, the format of the show is pretty straightforward. Off the back of the research I've been doing at Rethinking the Human Factor over the last, 12 or 13 years now, I learned a really valuable lesson, and that is that the challenges of awareness, behaviour and culture are not unique to the world of information security. And so what we try to do on the show is to engage with people outside of the information security industry and also within, who have lessons to share with us, insights, golden nuggets if you want to think of it, when it comes around from an academic or a practitioner perspective, sometimes from both sides of the fence, into how they have best sought to influence awareness and behaviour and culture within an organisation. Now, our guest today is from outside of the information security industry, and they work within internal communications. And internal comms was at an early stage in my own research. I identified internal comms as being a key stakeholder in the challenge that we face as information security professionals when it comes to that employee awareness, behaviour and culture. Now, I think what was really interesting is that having gone away and sort of really made a major effort to understand how behaviours are formed and influenced, I then started to look at how other sectors were actually going around trying to raise awareness to influence behaviours, and communications, both internal within an organisation, but also marketing communications as part of the marketing strategy to launch a product, for example. Clearly, there were lessons to be learned there. But what I found really interesting was that within the world of internal communications, a bit like L&D, I saw these ripples of change that were happening. And that change was being driven very much by people within the industry, internal communications professionals, had an aha moment. And that aha moment was driven by their own understanding through research around how behaviours are formed and influenced, and how you can take that sort of understanding and apply that to internal communications, and how it can sort of be a game changer for those security professionals. So I sort of spent some time speaking to a number of internal communications people who seem to be sort of leading that charge within their particular industry sector. And I was able to actually get this particular guest to agree to come on the show and talk about how she had seen the world of internal communications grow throughout the whole of her career, and how sort of, behavioural science, social science was starting to have an impact on how people who were leading the charge within internal communications were reshaping how the internal communications industry is going about doing what it's been doing for years. And I think it's really very important that we explore these external professions. And what I am seeing is how a lot of people are changing because of how we now better understand how humans make judgments and decisions, and that whole behavioural science piece. So yes, without any further ado, let's get on with the interview. Hi there, welcome to the Rethinking the Human Factor podcast with me, your host, Bruce Hallis. It's absolutely fantastic to have you here with us on the show. And yet again, we've been able to find an amazing guest. Now, this guest is somebody that I really wanted to get on the show because I had read her book, Successful Employee Communications. One of the things that really stood out for me, I've read a lot of internal comms communication books, white papers, and the one thing that was really missing for me was incorporating an understanding of how behaviours are formed and influenced, and incorporating that into how you design your comms campaigns and all your efforts, which seems to me to be really important because the majority of us in information security are trying to use comms to bring around changes in behaviour. And so with that in mind, I reached out to our guest and I asked if she'd come on the show, and she was brilliant. She said yes. And she said yes really quickly as well. So without any further ado, let me just introduce you to Sue Dewhurst. Hi, Sue.
Hello, Bruce. Thank you for the very warm welcome.
No problem at all. It was, how can it not be a warm welcome? When I read the book, and I had read quite a few books, and there was this element in me which was like, okay, I can understand this. It's talking about it very much from a communication perspective, but really for me, I just wanted to use communication as a means to bring around change in behaviours within organisations, like a lot of our listeners will do. And that was one of the things I picked up in your book. You understood that. And I was like, oh, this book's going to be a really good read. And it is a good read. And it's really well written as well, which is, listeners, it's a really well written book as well. So it's great to have you on the show. So, Sue, do you want to just tell us a little bit about your journey?
Absolutely. So in the field of internal communications, I'm a little bit unusual, I guess, in that I've always worked in it. So I did my degree in communication, and I started out as a graduate entrant in-house lots and lots of years ago, 20 odd years ago. And I did 13 years in-house as an internal comms person, head of internal comms, head public sector, banking, telecoms. I handled a lot of change during that time, anything from automation to through Chapter 11 bankruptcy, actually. So I had a few things to get my teeth into. Yeah. And then I left the in-house world, set myself up as a consultant, started off specialising in change, generally mergers and acquisitions or systems integration, and then fell into and ended up specialising in training and communication. So I spent about 15 years then training either internal comms people to do their jobs, hopefully even better, also to work with leaders and line managers to help them work more effectively with communication.
So you've had your hands in the pie, but from many different angles.
Different angles, yeah. And I guess as well, what you said about your own interest, Bruce, I'm quite fascinated by psychology, by what makes people tick. So along the way, I got myself a master's in applied positive psychology, and I've also done a couple of the behavioural science courses with Warwick University and UCL. So yeah, it's a real fascination of mine, is how do our minds work, psychology, people do the things they do. And I think it gets very interesting when you mix all that in with internal communication.
Point. I think I'm going to come back to later because I know it's something I want to dive in a little bit deeper, but I'm going to sort of draw our attention to internal communication. Yes. Can you just sort of like really explain to the listener? I mean, when I say internal comms, most people think, oh, internal comms. But in my research, when we ask people, what do you mean by, for example, awareness or behavior or culture, invariably we get lots of different replies. So could you just explain to us what internal comms is from an internal comms perspective, for somebody who actually does it?
Yes, I suspect you get different answers from anyone that does it. But these days, actually, I tend to talk about employee comms. Because I think internal comms, we've always talked about the communication that happens inside an organisation, whereas we all know these days the lines are very much blurred. So, my behaviour might be influenced, for example, by what I read outside about the organisation, or what we say inside might go outside. So I tend to talk now about employee communications. And so what I'm talking about is that very special relationship that organisations have with people who work with them or for them, whether they be employees, volunteers. But one definition I like of communication is about mutual understanding. So how do we help everybody in that organisation understand each other, find meaning, purpose in their work? And the other thing for me about communication is really about helping the organisation work better. So internal comms for me, it's an enabling function. So it's there to help the organisation do whatever it's trying to do in a smoother, more effective way, which could encompass anything from making changes to working better with customers to lots of different things. But yeah, those two things for me, I think, really is one about the whole relationships in that organisation, and the other about making the strategy happen.
It's really interesting that you sort of you dissected it straight away there around the internal communication piece and employee. I really like how you've done that, because I completely agree with you. When we use the phrase internal communication, we think of all internal communication that's going on within an organization, or we think about just very specific campaigns of communication, very, 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 very specific. But actually a lot of what goes on within an organization is outside the scope of the department that's given the label of internal comms. I mean, there's communication going on all the time across the organization, and internal comms tends to be quite a small function as well. It can't be responsible for everything. It has to be responsible for a very specific, set of objectives. And you sort of narrowed it down there in terms of employee communication. And then you're going, okay, mutual understanding. And then we were talking about trying to bring on change, trying to make things work better. And that your role was really as a facilitator. When you talk about a facilitator, is the idea that the organization brings the challenge to you, or do you facilitate a discussion around that? Or is it a case of you also proactively push the organization when it comes to employee communication?
Both, hopefully. So if there's a good relationship between the internal comms team and the organisation, then I'd hope that I guess, like IT, Bruce, one of the biggest bugbear of comms people often is being brought in too late. So
Right.
in best case scenario, we hope that the organisation will bring in internal comms and say, we've got this change happening, we've got this project happening, we've got a challenge with whatever it might be, costs, customer satisfaction, or whatever it might be, can you help? Also, I would hope that an internal comms person would, for example, meet with their senior stakeholders to understand what's ahead of you this year, what's in your strategy, what are your challenges, how can I help with that? So I hope it would be a bit of a two-way thing, really, proactive and reactive.
So part of the role is about actually sitting down with stakeholders across the organisation and trying to understand what it is that they're planning to do over the next 12 months, and then seeing how you can actually support them with that.
Absolutely. So for me, that's the way we want to be looking at communication. The way that we often look at communication in organisations is senior stakeholder comes to comms person and says, I want a story on the internet or the news app, or I want a poster, or I want an event, or whatever it might be. If you're lucky, that's what you get. But the question is, does it make any difference? Or do you end up just drowning people in that organisation with lots and lots of stories that you feel good because you've generated them, you've communicated, but in best case, it may not have made any difference. Worst case, you could have caused more damage because you're just contributing to the clutter in that organisation. So that actually is often how a lot of communication works, I think, is people want stories or events, and that's what they ask for. But yes, if it's working as it should do, then for me, a big part of it is that conversation that says, what's the business trying to achieve here? How do employees' actions need to contribute towards that? And how can I use communication to help that happen?
So it's interesting because, you paint the picture there about how anecdotally the trend seems to be that stakeholders will bring something to the internal comms function and they say this is what they've already decided what they need doing, which is interesting in itself because they don't necessarily have the internal comms experience. And just correct me here, but this is also things they need doing in the relative short term.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So leaving it to the last minute to actually engage the people who, one, the specialists in the specific area of internal comms, and two, are probably going to be supporting, if not possibly delivering, the actual activity that needs to be done as well. And this is something that information security people, data protection people face, or it's the same problem. We share your pain, though I suspect at times we actually generate some of your pain as well.
Things may be true.
Yeah. It's from an empathy perspective, I think there's probably a fair amount going on in the audience going, I understand that pain, I feel that. And then we're like, yeah, but sometimes we're the ones that actually cause that as well. Which I guess brings me round to, what difference does it make when you actually sit down with internal comms in advance? This is what we're looking to do next year. What difference does it make when you sit down with internal comms and you talk these things through? What is it that internal comms will then have the time to help our listeners, information security people, to sort of process as a facilitator? What's the difference between the two? Because one seems to me to be, do this, and you're like, okay, I've got to get this done. You may even have to say no. Do you actually say no? Do you say, look, great, you've brought this to us, but we can't do it? And I guess the other point is, if they'd come to you 12 months and given you 6 months notice or 12 months notice on something, then you can say, well, look, actually, we could have facilitated this process, which would have improved the chances of success.
Yeah, and being realistic, we may not be talking about 12 months. Organisations move very quickly these days. So, of course, timescales can be shorter. But I guess the first thing that comms people can really help you with is actually thinking through the problem. Again, I guess it's something that you guys will be coming from your perspective. But I was working actually on a training course with an organisation beginning of this year where, interestingly, they'd got the comms team and their customers in the same room for this course. I'd never had that before, and it was quite interesting. So We did have, example, people from security, people from IT, people from quality, and comms people in the room. And we got them working on real problems. And one of them I remember was actually IT security. And one of the really simple techniques that I teach people, which anybody can do, if it's one thing people take away from today, is please use it, is using this whole idea of do, feel, know. So it very simply says, okay, let's just take a quick step back and think about, at the end of this communication, that you want me to help you with? What is it that you want people to be doing differently? If this communication works successfully, what should people be doing differently at the end of it? How would you like to leave people feeling, and what would you like them to know? And we start with the do, because often in communication we don't do that. We start with, this is what I want to tell people, this is what I want them to know. So I force the conversation to start with a no, what is it you want people to do? And I remember distinctly this case that was focused on IT security, because it was so hard for the group to answer that question. They could talk in general terms about, well, what I want people to do is be aware of information security. And I was going, no, that's not a do, that's a no. This is a no. What is it that you want people to do? And I can't tell you how long those groups went round and round and round in circles. Can people, for example, post on these websites? We'd kind of quite like them to, but what is it okay to say or not say? And until you're really sure about what's the behaviour you're trying to get in the end, it's really hard for comms to help you do that. So I think one thing a good communicator can do is really ask you good questions that will try and nail down, what does success look like after this communication for you? Why is it not happening today? So if people are not doing what you want them to today, what's contributing to that? And once we've really got a good picture of that, that's when we start to be able to understand, okay, in that case, this is how we might use communication to help you. Because the danger is if you don't do that, you can spend an awful lot of time, energy and money throwing communication out there that will make not a blind bit of difference.
And I think that's really what I wanted to, with that question to get us to, is that sense of, you can do internal comms. People can deliver internal comms for you, but really it's about results.
Yes.
And if you don't produce results, it becomes harder and harder next time you come back asking for budget for, whatever your activity is. If you can't show success, you're less likely to be able to then get budget for further initiatives. So that little bit of that stepping back from and rethinking what the problem is, and actually being very clear about what the actual problems are, so you can design an internal comms campaign to tackle that specifically. That makes a difference, doesn't it?
It does. And to your point about measurement, and I think we'll probably talk more about measurement later, one of the keys to effective comms measurement, because it's hard, it's not easy to do good comms measurement, is if you get a really good SMART objectives, that's the key. It's going to make your life much easier when you come to measure later. So I see a lot of objectives, for example, that say things like raise awareness about safety, or what I want people to do is be an ambassador, or how I want people to feel is engaged. And I go, okay, what am I going to see people doing if they're being an ambassador? And if all my objectives say is I want to raise awareness, I want to leave people feeling engaged, I want to be an ambassador, life will be pretty impossible when you come and measure those things, because, they're very, very woolly.
So I guess that brings us on nicely to sort of, the next sort of direction I wanted to go with our conversation, the whole idea of being very, very crystal clear about objectives.
Yes.
Let's just use the word awareness, because for all our listeners, they'll be familiar with the term awareness, because, a lot of our work is driven by regulation or by law or by, contracts with clients and just general training of information security people. It's always when it comes down to education and awareness. And you just picked up awareness as well. So if you don't actually have a clear definition right at the beginning, you can't then come up with metrics which relate to it.
Yeah, and also they'll send you in different directions. So there's a story in my head that I'm going to come back to, but I remember one conversation I had with one organisation. I've just written down law on my notepad and put a big circle around it from what you just said, because we were having a conversation in those days about what used to be Sarbanes-Oxley. So, the organisations had to do. And the conversation was about, again, what's the objective? So is the objective to show that we have done what we legally should do? So, is the objective that by the end of this, we can tick a box that says we have got everybody in this organisation to read this policy, and they've ticked to say that they've read it? Is that our objective? Or is our objective that you actually want to get people understanding what's in this policy and taking certain actions based on it? And they are two very different objectives. They're going to drive your communication in different ways. That might sound pedantic, but they really will. If all I want to do is to get people to read a policy and tick a box, and that's a lot easier to do. than if I want to get people to really understand, well, Sue, this is what this policy means for you, and this is what you need to do as a result of it. That's much harder.
I think that highlights the difference, in terms of one is about, you set the objective, which is to make them aware and have a record of it. And the other one is to produce a campaign or a range of communication interventions. Okay. And then you go, oh, yeah, but the objective of this is to actually bring around behavioural change.
Yes, not just to be legally compliant.
Yeah.
I mean, the story I was thinking of actually is not a legal one, but I think it's an interesting example around awareness. I'd actually gone all around the world for an organisation doing some training for them, some comms training, because they were putting in a new set of values. And for them, this was a big thing because technologically speaking, they were number one in their industry and they were looking for what else is going to give us a performance advantage. And for them, it was about behaviours, it was about values. Say, for example, they wanted people to collaborate more. They thought they could get more sales that way. They thought their customer satisfaction could go up. So they invested a lot of money in these values and in getting me to train people about these values. And I found myself in this particular place this one morning in a room full of very unhappy senior engineers. I remember thinking, well, I've not even opened my mouth yet. Looking so annoyed with me. They're very forthright, so it didn't take one of them long to say, well, it's great that we're having all this comms training and everything, Sue, but don't you think it would have been helpful to have it before we started our communication and not after we'd finished? And I said, you finished? And he said, yeah, we're 96.75% compliant. There's an engineer for you. And I said, what does that mean? And he said, it means we've briefed 96.75% of our people. Within 3 weeks, our target was only to brief 90% of people. So, we smashed the target and we finished. And I said, oh, that's interesting. So you're telling me then that people are very well aware of these new values? And he's getting a bit more annoyed with me. He's like, yeah, that's what I just told you. We've briefed them. And I said, oh, that's interesting. So tell me then, how well do you think people understand why all this investment is going into these values? Because it took me a while to understand, literally this organisation is stopping the production line for these things. That's a big thing for the organisation to do. Do people understand why? And there was silence in the room. And then somebody stuck their hand up and said, well, I've got to admit, I've actually given 3 of these briefings. And I don't understand why this is such a big thing, why we're making all this fuss about it. And I said, that's interesting. And how do people feel about the values? Do they think it's a good thing to do? And people started laughing. And somebody said, no, it's just one of these head office flavour of the month things. They come along from time to time. They'll have something else next week. Yeah. And I said, is anybody doing anything differently because of the briefings? And they were like, doing something differently? Were they supposed to do something differently? And I said, well, I'm going to challenge you then, because you've told me that you've just finished your communication, and I'm going to challenge back that you've only just started, because you might have given some briefings that make people aware of the values. What you just told me is nobody knows why you're doing all this stuff. People think it's a bit of a joke and nothing's happening any differently. But interestingly then, Bruce, they challenged me back and said, well, that's well and good, but in that case, why will we set the target to brief 90% of people in 3 weeks? Because that's what we were aiming for and that's what we did. If you wanted us to aim for something else, you should have set different objectives.
Yeah, and I guess because the question really, somebody's come up with those, you've got to brief X percentage of people by the end of this particular date, 3 weeks from now or whatever it is. How are those milestones and metrics, how are they aligned to the actual objectives? And this is where I'm just producing some online training content, and I was using a film. I was trying to sort of demonstrate the difference between, if you don't have clear objectives right at the beginning, how things quite quickly start to go different ways. And I started to highlight the difference between magnetic north, that you might get in a compass, and the north that you get on a map. And how at the beginning, you all seem to be going in the same direction, but very quickly, because you haven't been clear about which north you're using, you actually end up getting people going in different ways. And the end result is that somebody might be just seeing it from a compliance exercise. We've got to do X by these dates, and we've got to achieve Y in terms of compliance, i.e. delivery. But actually, the whole thing is around that behavioural change. So it's not, the behavioural change doesn't happen at the point that you've actually delivered the comms briefing. Surely the objective is post the comms briefing, is the behavioural change. That's the actual bit that you're looking for, isn't it?
It is. And I think often that communication objectives that are set are, the objective is communicate. It starts and ends with communicate. And it's what I call a magic bullet model of communication. There literally are models of communication which are called magic bullet models. And they're information transmission models. And you can draw them. You can literally draw a sender on one side, you can draw a receiver on the other side, you draw an arrow from one to the other, and that is magic bullet communication. It says A sends a message to B, and magic things happen as a result. People suddenly think the subject's really important, they all change their minds about it, they all go and do lots of stuff, and we all know life is not like that. But often in organisations, we treat communication as if life was like that.
I'm glad you used the word magic, because we've actually got a magician coming on the podcast as a guest.
Way to make it happen.
Just make it happen. Do some magic in the corner there. Yeah. No, he's coming because he's coming to talk about how magicians use their understanding of how our brains work to produce tricks.
Right.
And to get us to think in particular ways. So there is a reason behind it. It wasn't just let's get a magician on the show. Okay, so in that particular case, though, where they push back, well, the good news is that they push back, because what would have been worse is if they just sat there and talked all the way through it. What role is internal comms, both as a sort of a distributor, but also as a receiver of information, gathering? I mean, in your book, you really make it very clear. Part of what internal comms is about is actually understanding the organization, the target audience, and being able to use that to better inform and better support and facilitate those discussions that need to be able to happen.
Absolutely. So it's about understanding the people's frame of reference. So I often use the analogy, if I'm talking about change, of a train, actually. So I'll sometimes say to project managers or senior leaders, okay, I'd like you to imagine for me as the leader of this change that you are the driver of a train. And as the driver of that train, you have control of it for a start. So you can control whether it starts or stops or slows down or speeds up. We like to have control as human beings. It's a fundamental human need. Brains like to see what's around the next corner. Yep. And also, as a train driver, when you look in front of you, you have an enormous train window right in front of your face. So the way forward for you looks obvious. It's enormous window in front of your face. And then I say, imagine the train tracks as kind of like the change. Sometimes we like to talk about curves, sometimes we don't, but at least what I do like about it gives the idea of people sometimes being in different places with the change. So there you are right at the front of the tracks. And then I say, imagine the people that you are about to be impacted by this change. And I'd like you to imagine that they are 10 carriages back in this train. So for a start, they don't have any control. So something that for you feels kind of completely comfortable, for them is not going to feel comfortable because they have not got their hands on the steering wheel or whatever trains have. And then 10 carriages back, the view from their window is completely different. So they can only see sideways. So things that for you feel very, very obvious looking out of your enormous train window right in front of you, they literally cannot see that. They're 10 carriages back, they're looking out of a side window. And then the third thing is, if you imagine the tracks as the change curve, they're right the way back down those tracks. So they're in a very different place to you. So I always say, to make our communications work, we've got to get out of the driver's seat and walk down into the 10th carriage. To try and understand, first of all, there's a thing you might have heard of called the curse of knowledge. Yeah. That once we know something, it feels very, very obvious to us. And we have to remind ourselves that actually it's not obvious to them. What's the view like from their window? Yeah. And also, kind of, what does it feel like? Once we understand people's frame of reference, you can find what I might call the angle that will then help that communication work for them. So an example I might give is, which is in the book actually, is something that my colleague Liam Fitzpatrick, who I wrote the book with, was doing some work with a housing organisation trying to improve safety from people that were going into these houses and doing jobs. So they'd done lots of communication around safety. And basically, when they talked to these people going into these houses, what they discovered was that they thought this was just people in head office. You hadn't got a clue, being jobs were health and safety rubbish. Actually, they were the experts. They knew what they were doing. They really cared about the people in those houses. And once they knew that was the frame of reference, the communications tactics formed around that. So, for example, the tactics that they used really focused on these people as being experts. And they said to them, look, we've really noticed that people in our houses are doing things that are unsafe. So, we've seen hairdryers plugged in bathrooms. We've seen unsafe this, unsafe that. What we'd really like you to do, guys, because you are the experts and you really care about your customers, is we'd like you to go and give them some tips about how they can be safer. And we'd really like you yourselves to kind of role model really safe behaviours so that they see you as an expert doing it and they see what they should be doing. So once they've found that angle that says, okay, let's not be head office being seen to talk down to people about health and safety.
Yeah.
We go with the fact that these people really are proud of their experts. So we tap into that. And the whole angle of the comms was about them as experts and as how they could use their expertise to help their residents be safer and hence work more safely themselves. So, yeah, I think once you really understand your audience, you've got a much better chance of having them pay attention to communication because people always have a choice. They can choose not easy.
The analogy with the train actually just got me... I was just imagining that point when you sat in a train, and you can imagine, I've never looked out the front of a train, but many, many years ago when I was much, much younger and we were flying on a plane, I remember these were the pre-9/11 situation. I remember being actually invited up as a child to the front of the cockpit. And suddenly the view out the front of the cockpit, I never forget that view. It's absolutely massive. And I imagine it's the same with the train. You get to see absolutely everything. But not only do you get to see absolutely everything, you get to see it well and truly in advance. Whereas if you're sat, down the train, like you said, 10 coaches down, you sat by the window, and depending on which seat you're sat in as well, you really only get to see things just as they're happening, don't you? So you barely get to see actually to have a heads up of the change, and you're not in control, like you say. And I think that's a really beautiful analogy. Often communication, our efforts arrive at people with people, and they might not necessarily really know that it was coming, and they might have a sense of anxiety around the fact that they have no real sense of control. Yeah, that's a really good analogy. And then also,
just add, I think it also means we can really overestimate what we can achieve by, for example, a short amount of communication. So on that point, I was with the management team last year doing some training with them, good management team, senior team, and they started off by saying, we really need this training because we're lousy at communication. And I said, goodness, what on earth makes you say that? And they were working on a big change. And they said that they'd been psyching themselves up to do this event for people. They've really worked hard on it, this event about the change. They wanted to leave people feeling excited about it, really going out there and taking actions. And they're like, we just didn't get that. We just didn't achieve it. We probably got a bit of awareness, but that's the most that we got. So, we really need to learn how to, do better events like that because we're lousy. And I said, how long was the event? And they said 2 hours. And I said, and how much communication had you done about this change before that event? And they said, none, it was the first one. And I said, and how long have you been working on this change? And they said, 8 months. I said, okay, so you've had 8 months talking about this, debating it, discussing it, getting used to it. And you think you can get people to the same state that you are after 2 hours. You're not lousy at communication. It's just not going to happen.
Yeah, I guess even if you make it as like visual, when people think about it, go, just make it visually impactful. When people talk about engagement, it's funny when I talk make it really exciting, make it grip people. And you can make something grip people. You can use absolutely great graphics and all the other bits and pieces. But actually, you're very limited on what you can do in a relatively short period of time. Well, 2 hours is actually not that short. A lot of people don't get 2 hours in terms of, spending time with people. But that drip feeding up front so that people are almost in a similar position to yourself before the main event, so to speak. It's about setting them up. It's about framing them for what is going to happen in the main event, isn't it?
Yeah, framing is a good term that's used a lot in academic communications, and I like it because to me a frame, I think of it as if you're kind of focusing a camera almost. That, in any subject, the subject is huge, and really our job with communication is to look at how do we want to frame it? Where do we want to try and focus people? And maybe, for example, you want to start with a wide angle and then you want to kind of focus in, get people to that kind of stretch.
I mean, you got that, you're using that picture there, metaphor of the framing it, focusing using the camera, but how important is the actual building the right narrative to that, moving people along that line towards your objective?
The narrative is really important. I mean, first of all, with that word narrative, it suggests to me stories, that as human beings, of course, we're built to relate to a narrative story, so once upon a time we were here and then this needs to happen and then this is what's going to happen in the end. We're built to go with that rather than kind of corporate messages. So I think it's really important to, I hate the word journey, but take people on that journey, allow some time for it really. And rather than thinking I've got a one hit and then I'm going to achieve whatever with it. But yes, the whole idea of narrative and storytelling, I think it's a whole other interesting area. And it's another thing you can learn quite easily, that if you want to kind of put a story together, you literally can use that structure that says, what's the beginning? Once upon a time we were here. All fairy stories are structured like that. Everybody's kind of living happily, we are here, and then something goes wrong. That's what happens in the story. So what's gone wrong? And then the most classic story structure is called the hero's journey, because that's what happens in fairy stories. The hero goes on a journey and there are challenges in that journey. If there were not challenges, it's a really dull story. There are challenges that the hero has to overcome, and in the end they all live happily ever after. And we can use that in our narrative as well. And I think one mistake we tend to make inside organisations is we don't tell people about the challenges in the middle. We kind of hop from it's terrible today and it's all going to be happily ever after. And it's kind of good to be open about those challenges in the middle and how we're going to get through them together. So narrative's an interesting one, I think.
And when it comes to narratives and communication, has this sort of like formal communication feel vibe to it. It's a communication campaign that's going to be going on. What's the role? Because in RNC, we often use the phrase ambassadors, and we use them as another way of, I guess, engaging with the audience. And also, both from a pushing messaging out, but also being a point for information to flow back through. And maybe it's almost a little bit like, from a research perspective, knowing what is the vibe that's going on in a particular business function, for example, as that person that's been put there who, from an ambassador's perspective, internal comms, using line managers as a whole, there's already a distribution network in effect just to the organizational structure. How can internal comms use the line management to get the messages out which bring around the changes, hopefully, in behaviour that we're looking for?
Well, again, I'm kind of going to challenge the fact that sometimes just sending out messages doesn't necessarily bring about behaviour change. But I think the interesting point from what you just said there, the question I'd be asking is, who's influencing people? And some of that influence may well indeed be their line manager. Some of the influence may well be the kind of people you called ambassadors, so peer influencers. So as part of any communication, I'd probably be trying to look at both of those things, really. So, how can we work with line managers, but also who else is influencing people, and how can we work maybe with those peer influencers? I mean, something that I like to do a lot, and hopefully more and more comms teams now are doing more, is to work with line managers to help them be able to work with communication tools. Because to your point earlier, comms teams can be quite small. There's a lot of line managers in an organisation, so you're going to have much better results, for example, if you can teach line managers to use things like do, feel, know, to get them to think that, for example, if I get a communication about information security, the first thing I need to do as a line manager is think, okay, for my team, what does this mean for my team? What do I need my team to do in relation to this? How do my team currently feel about information security? How would I like them to feel by the end of my communication? What specifically do I want my team to know? And the line manager is the only person that can do that. They're the only person that knows their team well enough. The comms team, usually based centrally wherever they are, is never going to know the audience as well as that line manager is. So to me, I'm really in favour of teaching line managers to work with tools like Do, Feel, Know, teaching them, for example, to think about putting themselves in the 10th carriage. So, just because the organisations ask you to do this briefing about values that they're really enthusiastic about, your team's not enthusiastic about values. So how can you find an angle for your team that may be something that you can tap into? So to me, if you've got, in the best case scenario, you've got your line managers and people like you guys, you know, your IT professionals, your comms people, and they can all use basic tools like, what do we want people to feel no? How can we put ourselves in the 10th carriage? What's the angle we need to find? Then it makes life an awful lot easier because you're kind of speaking the same language. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. And I think it's, I love this. The great thing about my job here as an interviewer, I guess, on a show is it's something like, and there's a whole range that throws up a whole range of other questions. I've just written down 3 here, and I'm like, I can't ask all 3 at the same time because that's a plain answer in perspective. Let me just pick up the first one here. Line manager, that's almost like training the trainers, isn't it? It's like, you know, you've got the structure in place already. And the line managers are there. How can you train the line managers so they can take the core messaging that's coming and then consider how to communicate that, share that in a context which is actually going to resonate within their own team based upon their knowledge. So that's the need for training. And I think that's really important because sometimes I get a sense in my industry, we talk about, you know, ambassadors and that's the end of the job. And it's just, well, actually, it's about training those people. Now, some people are more inclined to take more away from training than others. Yeah. So choosing your ambassadors is really important. Well, with line managers, you can't really choose the line managers because they're there. Ambassadors, it's about choosing the right people for those people to then go on and train. And in my experience, not everybody you could be the curse of knowledge. You can know your subject, okay, but it doesn't necessarily make you a great trainer.
Very true.
Yeah. So that's the thing that sort of lines up straight away for me is the need to train the line managers, you know, train the trainers type of thing. And the same with ambassadors, train the ambassadors, train the trainers, because they're the ones that are out there, you know, actually making the difference. They're the ones that are communicating at a very local level and considering things within the context of their own organization. The next one was the use of phrase influencers, ambassadors. What do you think makes a good influencer?
Someone who's trusted by the people around them. So if, for example, you see organisations who specialise in setting up influencer networks, you'll find that what they would often do is go inside that organisation and they will, in whatever way they choose, you know, putting cards around or focus groups or interviewing people or whatever, they'd ask people who they turn to when they want advice, for example, or if an initiative's coming up and they want to know if they should pay attention to it, who do they go to and ask? So for me, that's who the best influencers are. They're the person that if something's happening in that organisation, they're the ones that I turn to.
Yeah.
So what do you get this then? And either they say, oh, you know, I've seen it 10 times before, it never works, ignore it. Or they say, actually, yeah, I got involved in this. I do know a bit about it. And it looks, yeah, I think we should maybe give it a bit of attention. So that the response of that person can be really an interesting one. And to your point also about line managers, actually. So an example I remember, again, I think it's in the book from years ago when we were going through that Chapter 11 bankruptcy I mentioned, we'd had to do all kinds of awful stuff. You know, we'd had to close buildings, we'd done write-downs, we'd had thousands of redundancies. And the thing that actually broke the camel's back, the straw that broke the camel's back, was taking the free vend off the coffee machines. And that was the thing that, you know, we suddenly had uproar. And we had all these carefully worded email communications that had, you know, we'd asked line managers to brief people. And I got one sent back to me as the then head of internal comms. And it had just been forwarded, you know, so you saw this line of FYI, 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 until it got to the frontline manager. She'd added a line which said something like, shafted again, you know, shows how much we're valued, in inverted commas, doesn't it? And again, it's a really good example of who is it that's influencing people and what's the frame that they're putting on that, because all of the organisational carefully curated communication about that, for that team of people, the message they got was that one from their line manager. So yeah, I'm interested in who do people trust, I think is who do they turn to? They're the people that make good influencers, whether they're in formal leadership positions or not.
Yeah, I guess it raised the question for me that when you use the word trust, have you ever come across anything where there's a conflict in values between, well, I mean, when I think about information security's probably got a set of values associated with it by people outside of security. And then there's a set of values of that information security, data protection people place with their own policies and processes and procedures. You know, we all tend to value what we do. It's a behavioural thing more than potentially other people do. And I just wonder, when it comes to influencing, you might be influenced by somebody who does amazing, they're really, really good at closing a deal. Okay. And so, you might have a lot of people that look up to them. There'll possibly be people within that environment who might say, we're on the same level, so we're competing. And there might be a bit of friction that goes on around that. I don't know. But sometimes the values that a group might have towards an influencer, the values that influencer demonstrates, which are what draw people to them, okay, might be values that come into conflict with the values that are associated with your own particular area of the business, like information security and data protection, for example, like get things done, close the deal, versus stop and think, does this relate to security before you go on to close the deal?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think it's, that whole values piece is really, and understanding culture is really important for me in terms of communication. And I know that you mentioned Hofstede in your book as well, and the need to understand culture. What do you think people can do to better understand the culture of the organizations that they're trying to sort of communicate with and bring that change around?
Oh, that's a big question.
Maybe top level.
Top level. Well, I think you're looking at organisational culture, and you're also, you talked about Hofstede today, you're also obviously talking about national culture. So there could be there will be differences in how different nationalities communicate and react to each other. Culture is a big thing. I think it's helpful to understand the history of the organisation. So when you were giving the example you were there actually about closing the deal, it made me think of another case that's in the book about safety, where some of the issue is exactly that accidents were happening where people just wanted to make not a deal but a job happen in time before they lost the contract, and that's when accidents were happening because the focus was just make it happen. They didn't think about safety. But one of the cultural factors at play there actually is that this particular part of the organisation had been acquired by a very large organisation. Yes, the very large organisation was very much in favour of processes and procedures and all the rest of it, whereas this particular group of people had come from a small organisation where they were very proud of the fact that they were empowered and they could make things happen. So it was actually the other thing that was in play when these accidents were happening, because they kind of reverted to, if you like, throwing away this whole idea of having rules and processes and procedures with this culture that they didn't identify with, and harked back to those old days that they loved of being able to make their own decisions and being empowered, and they just did it. So I think just having sometimes an idea of the history can be important. Culture, I think it can feel too big. It can feel too big to deal with. So I'd probably be more tempted to ask a question about context. So, for example, if you're talking about some kind of behaviour that you want to happen or not happen, what is the context in which that behaviour is happening? So the context that you just gave there, Bruce, was, well, it's happening at those times when there's a deal on the table, there's not much time, and it gets a yes or a no. That's the context. And so to me, that feels a smaller question than what's the culture of the organisation, which is very hard to get your head around. Because once you understand, well, this is the context in which this behaviour happens, there are lots of things you can start to play with there. So, who are the people that influence that context, for example, and how can we maybe influence them? One of the things we know about behavioural science and communication is about being timely. So if you know, for example, that is a danger point, you need to try and build something in with communication that is the time that communication will happen. That, before, for example, any kind of big deal, there's a reminder that pops in that says, okay, guys, at times like this, we need to make sure that we think of, because otherwise those briefings that happened, one April day, 2 months ago, when we weren't in the heat of battle, nobody's going to think about that in a different context. Our behaviours are very governed by context. So that's the question I'd more be asking myself.
So I think the next one I want to sort of move to, and it's sort of quite clear within the book as well, the challenges around measuring things, So you used the title of your book is Successful Employee Communications. And I guess you bring it up to what is success? How do you measure success? Because I think it's one of the challenges that I often get asked about when it comes to sort of information security and data protection, bringing around change programs. What does good look like in terms of the human factor within security and data protection? And people want to measure that progress as well. So talk to us a little bit about what success is and how you might, as an internal comms person, want to go around sort of measuring that success, and maybe highlight some of the mistakes which get made.
So let me draw a distinction between what I'm going to call outputs and outcomes. Mm-hmm. So outputs in communication terms is the stuff that we produce in communication terms. So it might be the stories that we published on the app or the intranet. It might be the briefings that we held, the events that we held, the posters. So one thing that you can measure is outputs. You know, how many people clicked on our story on the intranet, and what percentage of people got briefed in that 3-week timescale that they were targeted for. The biggest mistake that gets made with measurement is people only measure outputs, and that is how they define success. So, that communication really works because hundreds of people read my story on the internet, 97% of people got briefed within 3 weeks, and I'm sure everybody saw my posters in the lifts. Of course, that doesn't tell you whether you achieved any outcomes. So outcomes would be coming back to do, feel, know. So if I'm teaching communication measurement, I try and get people to draw a line. And at the top is to say, okay, what was the organisational objective that you were trying to help influence? And that might be safety, it might be sales, it might be costs, it might be something to do with information security, but it will be something that is in all probability not only influenced by communication. There'll be lots of things influencing it. But I'm saying, okay, make sure somebody's measuring that because you want to see whether that's moving or not. And then I work backwards and I say, okay, let's look at what we can influence then. What is it that we need to get people to do in order that, for example, we have fewer accidents? Let's set a target around that. So let's, for example, have a target that says we want X% of people to, I don't know, do a bit of a safety audit before they say yes to the deal, whatever it might be. You know, that's what we want to do at that point. And then we work backwards and say, okay, how do we want people to feel? So we might think about words like perceptions, motivations, you use the word values, beliefs. So we might think, well, if people aren't doing those things today, what's the belief that's getting in the way? And there might be a belief that says the deal is the most important thing. You know, if I've got a choice between safety and the deal's going to win. So we've got to change that belief. So we might set an objective that says, I want people to believe safety is more important than a deal. Mm-hmm. And then and I'm going to set targets around that. So I'm going to say, you know, I want X percentage of people to believe this by Y date. And they're going to be a smart target. And then we might work backwards again and say, okay, what is it I want people to know in order to help them feel that and do that? For example, I might want people to know that your manager's going to support you if you take an extra half an hour before you say yes to a deal, if you do a quick safety audit. So set yourself a know, feel, do, make your subject, those statements smart, and then measure those. Because it's so much more powerful to be able to say, okay, I can tell you that at the end of this communication, 10% more people know that they should do this than they did before. Yeah. Look, bigger percentage of people now believe that safety actually is more important than the deal. And I've managed to get X% of people actually taking 30 minutes to do the safety audit before they say yes to a deal. That's very different from saying, I got 100 people to read this article on the internet, because you've got no idea what they did afterwards. So it's always do, feel, know, put yourself a target against it. People always say you can't measure feelings. Of course you can. Engagement surveys always measure feelings. You know, I feel proud to work for this organisation. Agree, disagree, don't know. You can make any statement like that. You know, I believe my personal safety is more important than a deal. Agree, disagree, don't know. You can always make feelings into statements which you can then measure.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting there, because there's an art to asking the right questions.
Yes.
You've been doing consultancy for some time, and a role of a consultant, a good consultant, is to ask the questions so that people provide the answers. It's almost, and it's interesting from a behavioural science perspective, people will, it's something called like the IKEA effect is one of the biases that people have. If you build something yourself. So I did an interview with Dan Arley a couple of years ago now on this show, and then we talked about how I built an IKEA bed.
Mm-hmm. Well,
but the thing is, in the interview, because we did it face to face, I showed him the bag with all the spare bits. And he looked at me and he goes, "The bed's safe?" And I was like, "Well, the children haven't fallen out of it." And I said, but I remember stepping back from the bed and looking at it, I'm feeling a degree of proud. I was proud because that was my I had made it.
Yeah.
And if you ask the right questions and people, come back with answers, and they basically define what the requirements are themselves, it belongs to them. They have a sense of investment in it, and they're more likely to support that, even when the times are hard. I think, by asking the right questions through a survey around emotions, for example, or how people are feeling, if you write the right questions, you get them to define things back. But also if you involve them in the process of defining the objectives in the first place, understanding the context, but actually going out and engaging with the audience to understand how they're feeling. I do think it's interesting when you say the do, feel, know. In my experience, we ask people how they feel. We're looking to measure they feel great.
Yes.
But I think there's a lot to be said in sort of like understanding how people feel. They feel really bad about the fact that actually, okay, so you want to do this deal, okay, but before it can go ahead and go through, you had to do the security audit. And actually what you're feeling as a result of that is that security just gets in the way of us getting things done.
Yeah.
And it makes me think, at that point, the feeling towards the security brand, if you want to call it that, is generally a negative one. It's frustration. And you play that back to the individuals that are frustrated and they agree with it. And then you come up with, okay, this is what we need to do for you not to feel like that. And what they need to do is to have spoken to us about this 2 months ago. Mm. Which is funny because with internal comms, for me, it's the same challenge that you must face in internal comms. People get frustrated with something and they feel frustrated and they feel negative and they feel they don't value it. And if you actually understand that and you can then use that to come up with the solution, and the solution in this case is, when you're working on a great deal, it looks like, something's happening, gets involved then rather than the point where you're looking to provide evidence that, you're following good security practices within your organization as part of the contract.
Yeah. I mean, you could even almost do feel now in the reverse, isn't it? To ask them, what is it that you want us to do? How do you want to feel about us? And so how can we work together to make that happen? Yeah, absolutely. And to your point about being able to refer back to questions as well, I think that, for example, even between you and the senior stakeholder, if you've agreed together, you both agreed that at the end of it, this is what we want people to do, feel and know. If, for example, as often happens in comms, we're then asked to put together tactics that we just think that's not going to work, you can go back and say, okay, so what we're agreed then, is it still the case that this is what we want people to do? Okay, let's talk together about the fact that, whether we feel this story on the internet is going to influence what people do in this situation, or whether it's actually something else that's influencing them. So it always gives you that reference point as well. I think it gives you something to come back to.
Yeah, we understand the power of, most people understand the power of anchoring something, and you anchor it right at the beginning with those very clear definitions, about what this is what we mean by this when we say this is the objective. And you can, as people start to go on a slightly different path, because that's what happens over a period of time, you've always got the ability to turn around to that initial scoping document and go, this is what we agreed the objectives were going to be, and this is what we meant by this. There's a clear definition. And the point you make really well there is you have the conversation with the stakeholder, go, are we still sticking to that, or are you changing? Yeah. And if they want, of course they can change, but there's a cost that comes to that change. And by cost, I don't mean necessarily an investment. There's also a risk. All the work that you've done beforehand, or at least some of it, is going to not produce the results that you'd initially intended.
Absolutely.
Right. Okay. Well, I've thoroughly enjoyed having a chat with you. And I'm absolutely convinced that our listeners are going to have enjoyed listening to your insights as well. We haven't laboured too much on the behavioural piece, which is an absolute passion of mine. I got the cultural bit in. And we've dealt with the trickier issue of metrics. When I think about how we started off here, that there's being really clear about what the objective is, really then having your metrics around that, and then, bearing that in mind in terms of how you do what you do. You say, well, okay, for us to be able to measure success, we've got to be able to talk about within the context of this metric, what is it we're doing that's going to enable us to produce that information, and how are we going to gather that information and report that? So it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for sparing a little bit of your time. We've been mentioning on a number of occasions the book. It is a good book, and it's really well written. And that makes it much, much easier to read. But that's what you expect from an internal comms person as the author, wouldn't you?
I hope so. We got you a discount, actually, I think.
That's true. That's true as well. So everyone who's listening, we've got a discount on the book. If you go to the show notes, the discount code is in the show notes. So Sue, thank you very much for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure.
The pleasure is all mine. Thank you for asking me.
Okay. Thank you very much.
So I hope you enjoyed that conversation I just had with Sue. I hope you can understand there. Sue is somebody with a lot of experience when it comes to internal communications over a significant period of time. And Sue will have spent her early career, understanding the basics of internal communications and then applying it. But what I found really interesting with Sue was she'd opened her mind. She understood that ultimately comms was all about bringing around a change in behaviour. Then the actual value of internal communications was minimalised. And, this is something we spoke about quite early in the interview, the importance of making sure that internal communications provides value and that people can understand and can see what that value is. So I think it's really interesting that Sue started to pick up that, behavioural science and how behavioural science could start having an impact upon internal communications. And even before we did the interview and we had a number of conversations, I think what I found really interesting, she was talking about things from an internal communications perspective. And for me, having spent so much time now looking at behavioural science, it started to tick box going, in the world of behavioural science, this is what they would call that. And so you could sort of see these changes going on with internal communications and how they're being driven by behavioural science, but also how they're being explained by behavioural science. And so I think it's really important, I really hope you take this away, that, internal comms are a major stakeholder. But there are two types of internal communications professionals at the moment, as I see it. There is the more traditional sort of internal communications where, it's around tried and tested standard corporate practices. And then there's this new breed of internal communications professionals come through. And what they're doing is they're recognizing, look, my internal comms is all about bringing around changes in behavior within the organization. And it's that recognition that it's all about changes in behavior which deliver value, which for me marks these leaders out in the world of internal communications. So it's, great if you can find somebody in internal communications who's sort of understanding that behavioral angle to what they're trying to do and how it adds value to even what they're doing, not just cybersecurity. This is a great partnership in the making. So yeah, it was fantastic to have Sue come on the show. Now, if you find those sort of insights of interest, how can you sort of get yourself plugged into more? Well, the good news is since 2017, I've actually been delivering a range of workshops and courses. But this year, 2021, I launched my updated range of courses. Now, there are 4 courses that you can actually attend, starting off with the Rethinking the Human Factor Foundation course and culminating in achieving the Certified Human Factor Architect status as well. So if you want to find out more about how you can get trained in the sort of insights that we've been sharing throughout the whole of the Rethinking Human Factor podcast now, which is in its 4th series, then please visit the www.rethinkingthehumanfactor.com/training website. And you can find out all about the courses that we are running there. Now, if you don't want to miss the next episode of the podcast, then how is it best to make sure that you don't? Well, the easy way is to use your podcast publishing platform, so Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, for example, and you can sort of register via that to actually receive our podcasts as they are uploaded. And currently the episodes come out on a fortnightly basis. The other way is just to tune into what we're doing on social media, on LinkedIn. So what do we have in the next show for you? Well, the next show is long overdue. I did this interview quite some time ago, back in 2020. And in the show, we are going to be delving into the world of international branding. We're going to be learning some really interesting insights into fashion and branding within fashion. What is branding? What isn't branding? How branding is used to influence behaviors, but also how behaviors are increasingly in this new world, especially with social media, how social media and behaviors are actually influencing brands as well. So this particular interview is with a director from the Sorbonne Business School who heads up all of their efforts in terms of branding. That's, branding from the perspective of teaching professionals, but also teaching students as well. And we're going to be leveraging something which is well known within France and well known within Paris, which is fashion. Okay, so look, come and join us on the show. It's in a couple of weeks' time. We're going to delve into branding. We often talk about branding and what that means within the context of cybersecurity. Well, come and find out what our guest has to say. I look forward to you joining us then. Thanks again for joining us today.